Hi everyone. So we hope you're all set up in place. We hope that you've read the Canvas announcement. This is the first of the PowerPoints that we'll be doing. Linda and I, we're recording this before the lockdown, so we're in that apartment I have the free use of in the Metropolis building, if you're wondering what's in the background for each of us. The next ones that we record will probably be after the lockdown and in our own homes. And it's important for all of us to respect the lockdown. If we respect that, even if you can go to the supermarket, it's not always a good idea to go every day just because you can. So please, everyone, look after yourselves so that we can all look after each other. Okay, so as usual, you'll hear Linda and I talking over the top of this. When we do talk over these PowerPoints, we're giving you a bit of an overview of the whole thing. The handout goes into much more detail. So it's not necessarily, you don't need to be reading the handout at the same time as we're going through this PowerPoint.
But it's a good idea to keep it handy and to definitely read it after and before the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Today it's about the Archts Services. So what we'll be doing is just a very quick overview. We will be doing each of the handouts separately as separate recordings. This way the recording itself won't be too large to download and upload for you guys. So we'll be doing just number 5, that's plain number 5 handout, the Archts Services, which is an overview of the stages of works.
Yeah.
We'll also be covering things like the need to put things in writing and where consultants come in, just briefly.
Yeah, and you'll see in the handout a sample letter at the end of that, which is quite useful because although we're required to sign a contract with the client, you want to kind of establish a few things in the letter beforehand. So last time, if you read through previous handouts, especially number 3 and number 4, you'll see ethics is a very important thing for us. Now, most professionals have a code of ethics that they have to abide by. Architecture is a little bit different in that the Institute of Architects that most architects are members of, they don't actually have a code of ethics because most architects, well, all architects are registered, and they're registered through the New Zealand RAB, the Registered Architects Board, and they have the code of ethics. So on the first page of your handout, you'll see number 50, terms of appointment, a whole lot of points in there about standards that we have to adhere to if we're doing our job responsibly and don't want to be sued.
And so there it is there, number 58A. Straight away it says that you must only complete a job with a client if you have a written term of appointment.
And those terms of appointments, as you can see there, and here they are, cover these key things. What you'll be doing is immediately what you think of when you're doing something like this, but it's really, really important that you tell the client what you will not be doing as well, the limit on your responsibilities. So the first one, even when we're standing on the site, looking at the job, looking at the chunk of land, is where are the boundaries? That's not our job to establish that. So we don't do that, the client, but we have to tell the client that they need to go and get a survey and establish where the boundaries are. And there might be other things as well. If we need a resource consent, often a small resource consent application, the architects will do that, but anything significant, then we have to hire another consultant to do that. We have to hire consultants to do the structural design and all of those sorts of things.
So it's really important right at the beginning of the job to have these discussions with your client and actually explain to them the limits of what you do. So what is included, but also what is not included, and also what falls to them that they have to provide.
And the main thing that the client, and we'll talk about this in a separate lecture, is the client's responsible primarily for paying. So paying the consultants, paying us, those sorts of things. You might think, why don't we just kind of like throw a contract at them and it's all written down in there? But just like you guys and me and Linda, don't look at the terms and conditions of the agreements that we tick on all the time, for instance, using Zoom. So you can't assume that the client's going to read through the whole contract that you throw at them. So it's important to have this conversation as well, just so that you're developing a bit more of a relationship with them and figuring out if they're the kind of person that you want to have a long-term financial relationship with. Are they trustworthy? Do you have a kind of like, is there a bit of synergy in what you will want to achieve on the job?
And it's not just also how much you will be paid, so what your fees are for each stage, but it's also the timing of the payment. So it's really important to discuss this with your client. A lot of people have operate on a day-to-day kind of business, and so their money is free up and available. But some people actually have money for large sums of money that we're talking about in construction projects, tied up for sometimes 6 months to a year. So they need to know beforehand the timing of the costs of both your fees, the consultant fees, and as you learned last year, of the construction itself. So what you'll be paid and also the timing of those payments is really important. And also the last one is the time program for the project. That's also really important to keep talking about and updating with your client. And remember that we're talking now about the time program for the Archts Services. This is not for the construction. We can't be responsible for what the builder does or doesn't do.
And the client will be saying, oh, I want it all done by Christmas. They always say that. That never happens. Architectural jobs, getting consents, all of that sort of thing take much longer. So it's about getting realistic about things as well. And as Linda was saying, the time program for the project, we can say to them, look, we're aiming to get the design done, and if you're happy with all of that, then we can get the building consent in by this month of the year. It will probably take this long to go through council in our experience. And then kind of like it will take this amount of time to find a builder and get some quotes from them. But from that point on, it's the builder who's responsible for nominating what the timetable is for the construction process. So we can't say to the client, yes, we will have you in the completed thing by Christmas.
Right. It's also, clients can be quite unrealistic about the time that the Architect Services will take in each stage. So they often think that design's very quick, and that the consenting process might be very quick as well. They do not understand the length of time that it takes to do the documentation for a full project. It's actually a huge amount of work. So you need to have those discussions as well, so that it is kept realistic. So you might remember the staging slide from last year, but effectively there are at least 7 stages of architectural services, and a lot of people actually break it down even further and make it a longer list than 7, or we can condense it down into sort of design, documentation, consenting, that's the contract administration, and then the actual construction phases, and then completion. So as you can see, the design stage itself can be broken down to pre-design, concept design, and developed design, and then detailed design. So even that first stage of design, before the working drawings are done or the contract documentation is done, can be quite a lengthy process for the client and the architect. And just as a guideline, a lot of architects I know use that when the client walks in the door and says, I want a new house, the answer is yes, it'll take 2 years. So just that's a guideline of we want it now, yay, we're really excited, but it won't be done by Christmas. It's a house of any sort of substance is quite often a 2-year project.
The other thing that we could mention, looking at this, as we also talked about last year, and we're conscious that there are a whole bunch of you, about 15 or so, that come from other universities, and we will be, as soon as we're allowed back into the architecture building, giving you the handouts for all that course from last year. But it's often quite common that clients get architects to do the design and then obtain the consents, the resource consent if it's necessary. Almost, it's very common in a lot of jobs that we do, and the building consent. But at that point, and this is number 5 that you can see on that image, they might say, we're not going to pay you to administer the contract. And as you'll be hearing about in the next lecture, you may have some involvement in there, but on a different fees basis. So, and we'll save that. We're just doing an overview now. We'll save that for the next lecture.
Yeah. So this is a handout from a few years back now. Sometimes some of the graphics are a bit of a giveaway for when things are produced by the Institute.
It's not the 60s.
It's
it just looks that
way. So the NZIA have updated this document since, but we like to keep these in, so to show how often things get updated actually.
Yeah,
no, good.
And also in the earlier ones, they tend to put a lot more information there, whereas these days, the Institute of Architects is a lot more cautious about liability. So they tend to leave stuff out. So we think that earlier ones often kind of like give you a bit more insight, into, just between you and us, and not public.
So this is a publication that the NZIA put out to speak to the public, not to architects. So this is a guide so the public can read of what architects actually do, what people don't realise, the scope of the services that we provide, and also what architects are good at, why have an architect at all. The architectural process is described for the client, so you can see there that you start the extent of the briefing process right through to building consents and contract administration. So that's just their document to help explain the stages. We've just got a couple of slides here on one very small project, and it's just an example of what happens in each stage, which you're all, I think, really familiar with. The reason is this picture of a printing press on the stage for pre-design is that this is a project of mine, and the client had just bought this old printing press and said to me, this is your brief. So sometimes the brief doesn't come in the form of an A4 page with 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes you get interesting clients who are interested in design, and she was wonderful, and she just came and said, this is the printing press, so that's your brief. I like the aesthetic of it. Away you go. So that's what we call design, the briefing stages. Design stages, this is around the sort of concept design for the same project. These are all the same project. This is, the next one is the develop design and documentation. So it's exactly the same space that you just saw that in the perspective. And at that point then you're also establishing the consultation team, so the broader people that are involved that you're not involved with. So on this project it was really just the structural engineer. And
you can see different kinds of communication methods here as well. So the perspective is something aimed at the client, whereas this drawing, even though you might, most clients could probably figure out what's going on in this plan here, but this is starting to be media that's aimed at the builder and the council for getting the building consent.
So that they can price that. That's the same stage, again, the documentation now, and there's the bit of paper that you need to go to the council with to apply for a building consent.
Of course, as you learned last year, this is there's way more in the way of drawings and details and a written specification, all sorts of other stuff in there.
Yeah. So the next stage would be the contract administration, procurement and contract. So that's tendering. Procurement is just a word for going out to tender to obtain a price. And again, as you learned last year, the architect overviews all of that and sets up the contract. And that final image is just construction and completion. So that's the image of the finished kitchen. And on the left, you can see that the printing press is actually part of the kitchen.
And that's very common, as we mentioned before, that you might not be part of getting the building built. But as you can see, this is Linda's job, as she mentioned. You know, we are very invested in design. Design is what we do, and we want a really nice design outcome.
Actually, that's a really good point, Bill, because I wasn't involved in the overseeing this job.
A good client, though, from the sounds of it.
And I wasn't able to be for various reasons. So, as I've pointed out before, there's a detail on this image that I can't stand, and I'd actually like to Photoshop out, and that's that little skirting that goes up the steps. But
I was looking.
That shouldn't be there.
Yeah, I was quite drawn to that and going. Oh.
But that's sort of the things that we see that the client.
Yeah.
But I do. There were lots of changes in that job, but the client, as I said, was fantastic, and that's always happening. This is another slide that you all had last year that talks through the different stages, and it'll be familiar for those that did the course. And again, it's just an example of how what Bill said just a minute ago. Each of these stages that we just did a broad stroke with, there's so much detail that goes into each of those stages. So yeah, the idea being that this is just the broad overview for now. Responsibilities, the important thing that clients sometimes need to know is that they are actually responsible for providing all the site information and financial information, and sometimes they definitely need to give you a CT, certificate of title, to prove that they own the site. But there are quite a few responsibilities there that sit with the client, and they often think that the architect will do it. And as Bill mentioned before, things like surveying.
They often don't realise that the whole raft of consultants that are needed, even in something, say if you're doing a... So you may have seen a brief glitch there. We're all adjusting to the new normal. So I think I was just mentioning often the clients don't realise how many consultants are involved as well. And they may have heard that architects' fees, and we'll be talking about that in number 7, might be something like 10% for a house or something like that, but they don't often realise just that there are engineers and all sorts of other people, surveyors involved as well. But the client's main responsibility is to pay.
Yes. Sounds straightforward, but actually that's sometimes debated.
Even if they've got a skiing holiday that they want to go on, or they've got private school fees that need paying.
And of course, the architect's duties also has to be written into that agreement for services, and that is that you must perform your agreed services diligently and with reasonable care and skill.
And note the term reasonable in there, and we'll be coming back and talking about that later on. Because if you say you're going to work to the kind of like the highest standards, they can always disagree that you've done that and that you're in breach of contract and won't get paid for anything that you've done. But we'll come back and talk about that later on.
And the disputes. Okay, so here's an example. Again, I'm just using my example from practice because this is the way I do it. Every single practice does this stage differently, has a different layout, often more complex. I work on small projects only, so I've managed to reduce this down. That's why we're using it as an example here. But effectively in those early meetings with the client and you're talking about the scope of works that you're doing what we've got there on the right of the screen, what I will be doing, how much does it cost, and also down the bottom, what I will not be doing. So that's kind of a one-page overview of what the contract might look like. We do actually supplement it with the NZIA contract. This is just to try to describe the contract visually very quickly.
And there's also one of my versions of this, At the end of the handout, it's that 2-page letter that you can see there.
All right, so basically you can see there on the left the breakdown of the stages: develop, design, resource consent, contract documentation, etc., and then on the right, how that translates if the building is worth a certain value. And also see the little boxes on the right. That's for the client to tick that yes, I want you to do that stage. No, for example, no, I don't need. I'll handle the building consent myself, thanks. So they won't tick that little box. So just to reinforce them again, what happens during the project is that these stages get blurred quite quickly in the client's mind, and it's really important to keep reminding them that when one stage finishes and the next one begins.
And I mentioned 10%, and we'll come back to this in number 7. I mentioned 10% for a house alteration before. You'll notice the total fee on this one is 7.8, and you'll also notice it's got the big word education in there as well. So 2 things: fees are often lower in these kinds of commercial institutional areas, and also you might be contracted to a ministry, the Ministry of Education or something like that, and they have people who are quite competent about getting procurement, getting quotes of builders and things like that.
Yes, so in that case they wouldn't tick the tender process, that part of the fee wouldn't apply. All right, right down the bottom too, there's the additional what I will not be doing. So that's consultant fees, that's the key one there. Bill's mentioned this already. Engineering, geotech, quantity surveying, arborists, all sorts of other consultants might be involved. And often clients will assume that that comes in your fee. You need to point out to them right at the beginning that that doesn't. Neither do the council fees, paying for the lodging of consents and picking them up. There might be extra costs in the resource management consent process, and also, as we've already mentioned, site levels and survey data. So if you point out that you're not going to do that, then when you suddenly need to hire a surveyor, then it's clear to them that that wasn't built into our fee. And the second page to that is just a kind of an expansion of the same thing in more detail. Don't need to go into it now. It's exactly the same thing. What I will be doing, how much does it cost? And then there's the terms of payments and responsibilities of the client. And also the note that this is to be read in conjunction with the NZIA contract. So it always accompanies the full contract in the end when the contract is signed. So quite often you can put the client off with a booklet of a contract on the first meeting. So presenting this kind of information can get around that kind of first shock of the seriousness of it all, really, for the client. And here is the cover letter and the time program. So as we mentioned at the beginning, you need to discuss the time of what will be done when, in general, with the client. And again, reminding you that the construction phase is out of your control.
And that time program as well, you can see the months there from November through to March. That's actually, it's normally easier to get through. It's easier to kind of predict a time program when you're dealing with someone like a school, a commercial institution, or an educational institution, anything like that. You're often dealing with some professional people, or they may have their own consultant, project manager, or something like that. Whereas often with housing, because people are so invested in their own personal property and their dream home, and that all sorts of complications can arise.
Yeah. So this particular one was a preschool. Okay. And here's the example that Bill said that he has included, and that's in the handout as well, the PDF, isn't it?
Yeah, right at the end.
So important, the cover letter is actually important because it actually kind of clarifies all of these issues that we just described.
Yeah. This is also a few years old from when I was practicing as well. So you can see the hourly rate charges there, $120 plus GST for myself for an hour. I'm worth more than that now.
internet connect. Are you still seeing the screen?
Yep.
Yeah.
I think that might almost be it for this one.
Yeah, I think we've got a couple more slides. So also following the cover letter there, see, I get my
Okay, so sorry about that. There was another glitch. The Wi-Fi in this building is not the best. I was mentioning that my fee on that letter was $120 now, and you'll see here on this one, not mine, Principal Architect, $200 now. That's more my speed, I think. So this is just another example of a letter. And it's also worth noting down the bottom, just above that little post-it note that's kind of just censoring some personal details, that standard conditions of the NZIA contract are attached. Because that's the basis we operate on.
And also just see how the letter finishes off is telling the client that there's quite a lot to absorb here. I thought I would outline as much as possible and provide a breakdown so that you can, obviously think about it over a bit of time. So acknowledging that actually what happens is the clients get hit with a lot of information, sometimes quite scary information in terms of the size of the job or how long it might take, and they can be a bit shocked. So it's really good just to point out that we are aware that that's a normal part of the starting of the EP job. Sort of humanises it.
Yeah.
Sorry, that jumped. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Talk about this one.
Yeah, and these are preliminary construction cost estimates, and we did often, for a bit of reassurance, we would go into a bit of detail like this now, but the advice of the Institute of Architects is not that we shouldn't, by all means, kind of like provide kind of broken down estimates, but it should come from the expert in that area who is the quantity surveyor, not through us. So even if I got these numbers off a quantity surveyor, I would get them on his or her letterhead. So that it's very clear that it's coming direct from them, not from me, because otherwise it could be, I'm taking on liability here by typing them out in a letter, because it's indicating that I totally agree and endorse them. Whereas actually I should be saying, we talked to the quantity surveyor, they've had a look at it, I'm presenting that to you now.
Yeah. So it's not that you can't do sort of cost assessments. You still need to, but that liability needs to be completely separated from the architect. And of course, you've got to make the brief. So we already made the example of the printing press being a brief, but it can be anything. The client can present the brief to you in any way, and you can ask the client, and you can actually find out information to help you with the brief in any way that feels right, that feels fit. So, for example, you could ask the panel when you get to do the panel how they form their briefs, and in the past we've had panel members say things like, I give the client a small questionnaire and some of it has what's your favourite movie on it, or something like that, just to kind of break up that kind of monotony of only function and actually try to understand the character of the people that you'll be spending a lot of time with and designing together.
And this is particularly the examples that we've just been giving, particularly in the area of house alterations and new houses, but that's very much the work that a large number of New Zealand architects do. So you probably wouldn't be asking an institutional client what their favourite movie is, but it really helps establish a kind of rapport with the client. And personal relationships are a big part of it, whatever clients you're dealing with.
And so the brief might be a one-pager like this one, or it could be 2 or 3 bound documents and substantially full documents. For example, if you were doing a community library, or something like that, where the council is actually predetermining the brief. It's incredibly thorough and complete, and it's got all the consultations with various community members covered and things like that. So the brief can be quite extensive. Or, as we've got given you an example here, just so like the one pager or the personal version. This is an example of a very quick breakdown of if there's the budget, if you take out the furniture, the GST and the fees, and what are we looking at, and working it out on the rate per square metre. This is actually quite an old one of your bill, because the 1875 would be a lot higher now.
That is not my handwriting.
Oh, it's not.
That is a very well known gold medal winning New Zealand architect, but it is from, as you can see, 2003.
Yeah. So what that architect was doing was working out that if the client has a budget of 675,000 that includes all the fees and GST, then the architect's telling them quite clearly that that means that their house is 270 square metres, and that, I think that's big, but they might have been dreaming of something bigger. So it's a short, the short way to sort of calculate how the size of the building that they'll be getting before you even start designing.
Yeah.
All right, keeping out of trouble. This is another really important document that the Institute provide for us, and they just, it's a really reminding document to sort of say, make sure you know who your clients are. Do you actually know their background? Are they, you're heading into a legal relationship with your client. Do you actually know what you're dealing with here? So also, as soon as things go wrong, how do you deal with your client's complaints? Things like that. So awareness of what happens when things might go wrong and how you can keep out of trouble.
And the number one that we talk about all the time is the cost of the job.
Yes, so fee agreements and getting those documents we've been talking about signed right up front. As you can see there, that goes into 7 sections of all the different parts that you can keep in trouble. And we're just giving that to you. Sometimes if your client, for example, you don't need to suddenly go out and be a stalker for your client, but when you get a new client, sometimes it's really good to find out if they've worked with other architects in the past, and give them a call and say, how are they to work with? Did you have any issues, anywhere? What are the good bits? What are they doing? How do they communicate? Were they clear with you? Just little things like that. And there's the summary at the end.
Yeah. And this little summary is really quite good, I think. And again, this one's a couple of years old, and the Institute's a little bit careful about how, because in these litigious times, the Institute's a little bit worried about kind of like its role and responsibility in relation to architects and the advice that it gives architects as well, because that can be seen as being a kind of quasi-legal agency kind of passing on legal advice to clients. But these are really good, even though it's kind of a couple of years old, there's a whole bunch of really good key points, so it's absolutely worth you reading through each of these. Can they be trusted? Do they pay on time? Are they efficient? How, as Linda was saying, how do you work that out? New Zealand's a small country, and Auckland's a small town as well. So often you do find around, you do phone around. And there are a lot of people that do, we're talking in the housing area, a lot of people think they're building their dream home, but it's quite common that you see a house built and then it goes on the market a few, not that much longer later. So we get serial people building houses as well as kind of, the council building libraries, schools building their own buildings, all of that sort of thing. So it's easier than you think to phone around and kind of like get a bit of a feel for your client.
And this summary is quite good. It includes things that are not really in the scope of work, like ensure you deal with adjoining owners to avoid problems. So a lot of the architects' work, that's not, you don't have to go and meet all the neighbours and have a chat to them and say what you're about to do. But, because it will take you a few hours out of your day and you're busy, but actually it's a really, really good idea because if any problem happens down the line, they're not going to feel sort of left out of something that's affecting their life. They feel like they're part of it and that they are aware of what's going to happen in their street. So it's really important just to ensure that relationships are kept tended to.
Yep. So I think that's pretty much it. Like I say, this was very much an overview. And we'll be coming back in the next one. So I think this is the last slide, Linda.
Yes.
So
Yes,
the next one, number 6, will be in a different podcast, if you like. So for the next one, go and have a look for number 6, which will be uploaded by now.
And that's just going into the AAS in a little bit more.
Yeah, a little bit where we take you through the actual contract that you sign with the client. Last year we talked about the contract between the client and the contractor, the builder. This year we're talking about the contract between us and the client. So we'll go through that in more detail next.
Thank you, and see you again soon.